So I've been working on a cozy pixel art valley scene that started like this and eventually became this. So let's see how I created those hills and mountains, starting from basic silhouettes to 3D objects and then to the final result. So I started creating this scene by drawing the main components of the image, which in this case are the mountains and also the river that flows in the center of the image towards the horizon. And those tree shapes didn't end up in the final result of the image, as you will see later on, but it helped to figure out the initial perspective I was going for, with a vanishing point in the center of the image, as you can see here. And also the hills vanish towards that point into the distance of the image. I also created an initial house on the one side, then I decided that the other side would be actually better. For that I created also a second vanishing point that is outside the canvas on the left side. Also, this house will not end up in the final version, as you will see, but more on that later in the video. So then I started creating the hills, and you can see I started with a simple silhouette of the hills, and by simply looking at those silhouettes I tried to figure out what is the actual 3D shape of those hills that I was going for. And once I had an idea of how these shapes look like, I added some helping lines here that you can see, which created this net structure that you can see almost like a wireframe of a 3D object, just to give me an idea of the shapes I was going for and to help with the perspective and overall slopes of the different parts of the hills. So once I had these, let's say, wireframes in place, I started coloring them, paying attention to where the light was coming from. So I decided the light in this case was coming from the sun in the top left corner of the image. That's why all the top left parts of those sub-shapes of the hills are in highlighted colors and the opposite sides are in a darker tone. So as you can see, I went multiple times over the entire hillside, refining the lighting and shadow structures that I had laid out before. And once I was happy enough with the result on the right side of the hills, I also did the same for the left side. And this allowed me to create this slow incline of the hills that becomes steeper the further you go up. And you can already see that the house that I was drawing initially didn't really match with those structures anymore. So I ended up hiding it. And so once I was done laying out these basic hill shapes, I started using the shading tool to highlight even more the parts of the hills that are in direct sunlight, and darkening all the parts that are in the shadows. And as you can see, I was also tweaking the colors of my palette while I was creating the image, just to make sure that I was happy with the values in the overall scene and that everything stayed readable. Once I had done that step, I created a simple shape of the sky with different tones of blue. And I also added a sphere in the place where the sun should be, in this case indicating the sun being behind some cloud layers, which is why you see it as a highlighted sphere on top of all the blue shades that I created. You can see also I created a second sphere shape in the sky. This is something I didn't end up keeping in the final result, but I kept it for quite a while working on the image, because I had the impression that it gave the sky a bit more of an interesting look and made it a bit more dramatic compared to just having those flat colors stacked on top of each other. But you will see later in the video what I did to the sky eventually to make it less distracting than this current shape that you see there. So then I also added shading to the mountains behind the hills. And the overall concept here is to have less details for the objects that are further back in the image, and also to reduce the saturation of the objects that are in the back, especially the even lighter gray mountains that are even further back. So then I went and added another layer of highlighting and shadowing to the hills, again using the shading tool of Aseprite. And here I went a bit overboard in the beginning, so you can see that there were some parts of the hills that were now overly detailed, and by accident I ended up with a problem of banding, which means that in certain parts of the hills, as you can see here, there were too many little details and too many individual pixels, basically too many different shades of the same color in a too small location, which is probably okay if you do it everywhere in the image as a style decision, but since it only happened here in some parts locally, it didn't really look right. So as you can see here, I took some time to clean that up. And cleaning up here means to figure out the individual pixels that were too much detail and merge them together with the surrounding pixels, essentially creating bigger clusters of pixels again, so that the overall level of detail was reduced in those parts of the hills. After that, it was time to create again the houses that I was going for, and as you can see, I decided to create much smaller houses, essentially increasing the overall scale of the image without really changing the size of the mountains, but just by making the detailed objects inside the valley much smaller than I had initially planned. So that applies for the houses and also the trees. So by making those objects smaller, the hills and mountains by comparison appear much larger, which is an effect that I thought was really helpful for this scene. So after the houses, I also created some tiny little fences and a little car. So you can see here that the car is actually the only object in the scene that gives away the fact that this is a scene in modern times with modern technology. If you left out the car, it could also be some different setting, like a fantasy planet or something that is just purely based in nature. But actually I have a little project in mind for this scene, which is why I created it. And in the context of this project, it makes sense to have the car there, which is why you see it there. I might talk a little more about this project that I'm referring to here in some future videos on this channel though. So after I created some more little details inside the valley, it was time to also clean up the water a little bit, or let's say add more details to the water, because it was still quite a plain blue color. So I added some more highlights and dark parts to the water surface just to make it look a bit more interesting. And finally I went back to the sky and the sphere that didn't really make much sense from a realism point of view. But not having it like this also didn't seem very right to me, because then the sky was a bit more boring. So the sphere that I had in the beginning did add something, it did add a bit more drama to the sky, but at the same time it was also too distracting, and it was not really the point where the eyes should go when you look at the image. So in the end I decided for a compromise by breaking up this shape and still using some more interesting color variation in the sky, in the clouds, but at the same time removing the distracting shape that didn't really make sense. So one of the advantages of digital art such as pixel art is also that you can of course just flip the image and mirror it horizontally or vertically or however you like, just to see how that works and what it does to you as a viewer when you look at it. So what do you think? Which version would you prefer? Also, one thing that is still missing here now is to add some nice animations to the overall image, like the river actually flowing or the trees slightly moving in the wind, or maybe people that are walking around. And speaking of that, if you would actually like to see how I created a walking animation for this human character, then you can click on this video now and I'll see you in a bit.